everyone to our webinar on Is the United States Catching Up? International and State Trends in Student Achievement. Today's event is convened by the Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. Our moderator is Amanda Olberg, who is a research fellow at the Program on Education Policy and Governance at the Harvard Kennedy School Taubman Center for State and Local Governments. Amanda will be starting us off today.
Thank you, Jessica. As Jessica mentioned, I will be moderating a question and answer session at the conclusion of the presentation. Please remember that you can submit questions at any point during the presentation, and we'll queue them up for the end. Right now, I'm pleased to introduce Eric Hanyashek and Paul E. Peterson, two of the authors of the report entitled Achievement Growth, International and U.S. State Trends in Student Performance. These authors will be sharing a summary of the findings with us today. Eric Hanyashek is the Paul and Jean Hanna Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution of Stanford University, and Paul E. Peterson, who will be beginning the presentation today, is the Director of the Program on Education, Policy, and Governance in the Taubman Center for State and Local Government in Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. So now I'll turn it over to you, Paul.
Good afternoon. It's afternoon time here on the East Coast, and wherever you are, welcome. The purpose of our study, Achievement Growth, International and U.S. State Trends in Student Performance, the purpose is to identify the variation in achievement growth in math, science, and reading among the states. And as soon as we get the PowerPoint slides, there we go. So we're going to look at achievement growth. We're not going to look at just levels of achievement, which has been what a lot of studies have done in the past, which we have done in the past and others have done in the past, including the United States government and international organizations. They've looked at which countries are performing at a particular level at a specific time. We're going to be looking at the change over time. So we're going to be focusing on achievement growth. Now, achievement growth is going to be is the goal that has been enunciated many times by the leaders of the United States as early as the Reagan administration and the Nation at Risk. It was stated as a goal. George H.W. Bush brought all the governors together in 1989 to reach international standards by the year 2000, and it's been repeated again and again by our leaders as our main objective in education. Well, how well are we doing in achieving that, and how important is it that we do well? Well, there's recently been a task force for the Council on Foreign Relations, Joel Klein being who was the chancellor of the New York City school system, being one of the co-chairs, and Condoleezza Rice, who was Secretary of State, being the other, put it very strongly. They said human capital will determine power in the current century, and the failure to produce that capital will undermine America's security. So there is a significant body of opinion who believes this is an extremely important objective. Now, the data that we're going to use is up on the screen. The sources of information come from 4 tests, including the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is known as the nation's report card, and really provides the basis for much of our analysis. But that's performance on that test is linked to performance on the international tests by a methodology which we explain in our report, which allows us to equate performance on the NAEP with performance on the PISA and the TIMSS and the PEARL, the international tests. And it's a fairly technical process, so I'm not going to go into it in the webinar here, but if you have questions about it, can respond. And Rick Hanushek, who's was one of the persons who played a key role in doing all this linkage, along with Ludger Wussman, the third author of the study, can explain it to you easily enough. So there are two analyses it's important to stress. One is the international analysis that allows for a comparison between the United States and 49 other countries between the years 1995 and 2009 on 28 international tests taken by students at ages somewhere between 9 and 15. And then there is the U.S. state analysis, which covers a slightly longer period of time, 1992 to 2011. So for that second analysis, we have 20 years of data. For the first one, we have 14 years of data. But for the second analysis, we only have it for 41 states because only 41 states agreed to participate in NAEP testing in 4th and 8th grades as early as 1992. Others came in later when No Child Left Behind came into effect in 2002, but we preferred having 20 years of data before pronouncing on which states appear to be doing the best in moving their students forward. So we're going to calculate everything in terms of standard deviations. The technicians in the audience understand that. For the rest of you, just remember that 100% of a standard deviation is probably roughly comparable to 4 years' worth of learning between 4th grade and 8th grade. It's a little bit larger than the difference in math performances between the United States and the leading countries of the world. It gives you an idea of the order of magnitude. So 25% of a standard deviation is, roughly speaking, a year's worth of learning, and that's very rough. So what is our main finding? Our main finding is that in the United States between 1995 and 2009, it appears as if the United States was growing at the rate of 1.6% of a standard deviation in student achievement in 4th and 8th grades. And over 14 years, that adds up to 22% of a standard deviation. That sounds like good news. That sounds like kids are doing almost a year's worth of learning more in reading and math in these grades from over this, there's been that much improvement over the past 14 years. You could almost say that the No Child Left Behind law and other innovations have had a positive impact. But if you look at us in comparison to other countries, you find that other countries too have been improving, and the rate at which other countries have been improving has been greater than that of the United States in 24 instances out of the 49 countries that we were able to look at. Or, in other words, the United States is right in the middle of the pack. It's number 25 out of 49. And here is a list of the countries. A little bit hard to read. Download our report if you want to take a closer look at this. Notice that Latvia, Chile, and Brazil are at the top, and Sweden is at the bottom, and the United States is that green bar on the second column, and that red line running across represents the United States. So that's the picture. There's a summary statement of some key countries there. These are the countries with the highest achievement growth: Latvia, Chile, Brazil, Portugal, Hong Kong, Germany, Poland, Liechtenstein, Slovenia, Colombia, Lithuania, and the United Kingdom. Those are the ones that were doing decidedly better than the United States. Now, a question comes up as to whether this 1 year's worth of growth or 22% of a standard deviation growth is too rosy a picture. And this is one of the things we've pondered over. And I think the best way to think about it is to look at it in 3 different ways. One, this is the first one is the official way, that would be the main way we're looking at it. And it's 1.6% of a standard deviation annual growth in all the tests, putting us in 29th place. But if you only looked at the 8th graders, you'd see that the growth rate is 1% of a standard deviation, which is, substantially less, about 2/3 as much. And it puts us in 21st place. But it does put us in 21st place because other countries also
there's another standard that we might look at, and that is what happens to 12th graders, or what happens when students are about ready to go into the labor market. And there we know from the U.S. NAEP that there's been virtually no change since 1970 in the performance of our students at 12th grade. So one of the underlying concerns that we cannot answer in this report is whether the gains that we've seen in lower grades will eventually translate into gains in more skilled adults out in the labor force.
Well, moving on to this question of how important is this, and what countries are doing better and why they are doing better. The first thing we want to take a look at is the obvious question that, it's easier to move forward if you're starting far behind, as opposed to another position that you could take. It's easier to move forward if you've already accumulated a lot of human capital. So there's sort of two theories out there. One is we call the catch-up theory, that it's easier to catch up than it is to keep moving forward. And the other theory is, no, it's easier if you're at the top of your game to still improve it further. And in fact, we don't find in the international data much evidence for either of these theories. That basically we don't see much connection. There are some countries that did catch up. They were behind, and those are on the left-hand side of the graph. But then there are other countries that were ahead to begin with, and they're on the right-hand side of the graph. And so you can see, when that black line is very flat, as it is here, it's almost straight across, then that's an indication that overall, when you look at all of these cases, you don't see much to support the catch-up theory. Rick, do you have any observations?
Well, the other thing that you didn't emphasize, Paul, that I think we should point out is that some of the countries near the bottom of this graph are actually losing ground by these measures. It's hard to get an absolute scale on these performance, and so you might think that the gain is all because the test has gotten easier or changed over time or something like that. But you see that there are countries like Sweden and Bulgaria and others that have actually lost ground over time in terms of achievement. So it's not an automatic thing that you gain.
Now, moving to the states, for 9 states, we don't have any information, including the very large state of Illinois. And the rest of them are smaller states, though fairly large states, Oregon and Washington, are also non-participants back in 1992. So we can't include those states in the analysis. But for the other 41, if you look at this map and look at where it's a dark, solid green, those these are the ones that performed the best. Maryland, Florida, Delaware. Gold medal to Maryland, silver to Florida, bronze to Delaware. Massachusetts, it goes to the Olympics. I think there's 4 of you in the time trials or whatever get to go to the Olympics, and so Massachusetts is very close. It's essentially the same as the top 3. So those are the states that walk away with a prize, and the states that gain the least are a variety of places, but some of them are some of the highest performing states in the country, including Iowa, which gained the least, and Maine, Oklahoma, Wisconsin, Nebraska were the others. Here are some of the states that are states that people, you have fairly large states, you wonder how well they're doing. They're sort of in the middle of the pack, maybe a little above average. New Jersey, California, Texas, New York, Colorado. Now, one of the questions that we get a lot is, well, are the gains coming from the low-performing kids, or are they coming from the high-performing kids? Are the states that are making progress with a particular type of student, or is the progress across the board? And this graph here just shows how much progress is being made with low-performing students as opposed to high-performing students. Now, if it's a total across-the-board improvement, everybody's improving at the same rate, then this is going to be a very steep line that's going to go from 0 to 100. And if there's a negative, if the gains are at the expense of one group as opposed to the other, then it's going to be Rick. How's it going to look?
You're going to slope down to the right. The vertical axis here is the percent below basic, or how many of those are erased by new knowledge. And the larger that number, the better we're doing at the bottom end. The horizontal axis is the percentage that are that move above proficient, at least proficient and maybe to advanced levels on the NAEP. And so the higher numbers there mean that we're doing better at the top end. And what you see is that states that do well, like Massachusetts, do well with both the high achievers and the low achievers. Massachusetts is up at the top right-hand corner. But then you get down on the left-hand side to Nebraska and Iowa, and you see that they're doing badly with both the high achievers and the low achievers. So that states that figure out how to do education do it well, and they do it well for everybody. But the states that don't figure it out do badly for everybody.
So it is wrong to say that Massachusetts and Maryland are raising the scores of the top performers but are not doing anything for those at the bottom. That's not the message here. The message is they've moved everything across the board, and those states that aren't doing anything generally speaking, everybody's being affected. There are some exceptions to that pattern. There are some states that are a little bit, Texas, I think, is a little bit off the black line. You can see that there are some.
They're doing better at the bottom end than at the top in relative terms. But this has been the charge of NCLB that says that all of the attention has gone to the low performers. I think the answer is that where gains have been made, they've been broadly based.
So the one state you might say is worked too hard to help out the less achieving students is maybe Texas.
Well, they've done quite well on both.
Or not enough to help out the top performers.
They've done quite well on both ends. It's been a little bit skewed toward the bottom end, is the way I would phrase it.
Yeah, that's better. That's a better phrase. Okay. Now here's the catch-up theory applied again. The catch-up theory, as we discussed before, says that the states that are furthest behind will find it easier to move forward. And in this case, the theory has a little bit more to say than it did with the international data. So when we looked at countries, we didn't see much evidence for this. It was pretty much of a flat line. Here it's not an overly steep line, but we do see some evidence that the states that were the highest performing states, like Iowa and North Dakota, gained the least, whereas, well, you describe it, Rick. How would you put this?
Well, I mean, to be clear, Paul, we haven't tried to get any causation here of what causes this, but we're just trying to describe this. And there's a tendency for the high-achieving states to grow less, and for the low-achieving states, which tend to be concentrated in the Confederate South, they tend to grow more than the other states. But this just shows the pattern that's the same as the map, but putting it all together with where they started.
And here is the case that we need to spend more money in order to get achievement growth, because we put together all the data that we have on expenditures between 1990 and 2010 with the data on achievement growth to find out whether the increment in expenditures is correlated with the increment in achievement growth. And I think this is a pretty interesting graph, because while it shows that some states spent a lot of more money and did get a lot of growth, there were other states that spent a lot of money and didn't get much growth. And then there are some surprising states that didn't spend much more money but still got a lot of growth, and some that spent little additional money and didn't get much growth. So overall, there's very little connection. And Rick, I know you have something to say on this.
Well, this is the classic picture that allows everybody who has an opinion to express it. If I want to say, well, it doesn't take money, but you can get a lot of growth, you point to Florida in the top left-hand corner. If you want to say that growth comes from spending more money, you point to Massachusetts in the top right. But the answer is that it's not money from this picture across states. That's confirmed by lots of other research, of course.
And then finally, here is the question about how important is this all. We started with that with Condi Rice's observations and the task force that she was the co-chair of, saying was important to American security. This is more of an economic look. Are the countries where the test scores have improved a lot the same countries where you've seen a lot of economic growth? So, Rick, do you want to interpret this slide for us?
I will briefly summarize this. This is some work that Ludger Woosman and I have been doing separately on what leads to more economic growth across countries. And what we've found is that the growth rate in GDP, gross domestic product per capita, across countries is very highly correlated to scores on these tests. But we want to know more than that. We want to know if a country does manage to improve its scores, should we see its growth rate get faster? Should their growth rate improve over time? And this is just a simple plot that has the growth in test scores, the trend in test scores along the horizontal axis, and along the vertical axis is how much does the growth rate improve over time. And what you see is that the countries fall pretty much to a straight line, quite surprisingly. But this is further confirmation that it really does matter whether we can improve our scores. It makes a huge difference economically.
So we can't summarize the importance of our findings any better than to quote from Charles Voss, the former president of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. America faces many challenges, but the enemy I fear the most is complacency. We are about to be hit by the full force of global competition if we continue to ignore the obvious task at hand while others beat us at our own game. Our children and grandchildren will pay the price. We must now establish a sense of urgency. So that's our presentation. I know a number of you have questions. I hope the audio has improved. So Amanda, what do people have to say?
So thank you to everyone who has submitted questions already. Please remember that you can continue to submit questions now using the box on the right-hand side of your screen. Our first question comes from Doug, and the question is about the catch-up theory graph, which is figure 8. So we'll see if we can go back to that graph. And while we call up that specific slide, I'll share the question with the group. The question is whether it is safe to say that those in the far bottom right corner, which would include Wisconsin and Iowa, are most explained by catch-up theory.
I would explain them by complacency myself. They started out at the top. In fact, Iowa was the top performing state on NAEP in 1992, and it's fallen to 14th or 18th over this 20-year period because it, I believe, decided that it was doing a good job and it was going to keep doing a good job, but didn't think about what other people were doing.
So actually, Iowa fell from first place to 22nd place. Wisconsin fell from 4th place to 12th place. And, you know, what's really amazing, if you go back to 1992 and you look at which states were doing the best, the top 7 states were all touched the Canadian border or touched a state that was one of the top 7 performing states, which the last exception being Iowa, which is next to Minnesota, but doesn't directly touch the Canadian border. The rest were all at the very top. That's Vermont and Maine and Massachusetts. No, I guess Massachusetts doesn't touch the Canadian border. But then there's also Wisconsin and Minnesota, North Dakota and Iowa. Well, you know, 3 of them have fell off out of the top 10 states, Wisconsin and Maine and Iowa. And so, okay, you can say, okay, the other states are just catching up. It's all a natural process. But, you know, Massachusetts went from 7th place to 1st place. It is possible for a top-performing state to move to a still higher level of accomplishment and was one of the fastest-growing states in the country. So, you know, catch-up theory is a very convenient excuse for the state policymakers in Wisconsin and Iowa and Nebraska.
Great. So going to our next question from the audience, the next question is regarding the correlation between money spent and the gains made in the states. And the question asks our researchers to speak more to that point of why specifically there is no correlation between expenditures and growth. Rick, would you like to take that?
Well, there's been a huge amount of research on this topic, of which I've been involved in some of it, but so has Paul and others. And internationally, Ludger Woosman, our third co-author, has also. What all of the research suggests is that how you spend money is much more important than how much you spend. This does not say that if you had extra money you couldn't do better, or that no state will do better. It says that typically the way we've been operating our schools, you should have no presumption that a state that spends more will in fact get better, because historically they just have not spent their monies in productive ways. Now, this gets beyond our study, but what we've talked about in a variety of other contexts is that better accountability, more choice in the schools, and better local control of schools is likely, by all the evidence we have, to improve the use of funding and to try to make this better, to get better, more efficient use of funding so that dollars spent translate into extra performance.
Actually, a way of thinking about the catch-up theory is that the states that are way behind, I think, in the 1990s, when there was a call for improving education, there was a real surgence of commitment to doing something different. And it came mainly out of the gubernatorial office. Governors, whether they were of one party or another, had a new commitment to this objective, especially in the South, somewhat in the West, but mostly in the South. And definitely you found much less urgency in the Midwest. In the Midwest, there was a feeling, look, we're at the top of the heap. We don't really have to move forward. And I think it's time for a sense of urgency to come to the Midwestern part of the country.
Great. So we have a couple of questions that have come in that are asking about whether you considered factors that may have accompanied the state gains or lack thereof, such as demographic shifts or gender differences, boys versus girls. Can you speak to that at all, Rick?
Well, we can speak a little bit to that. This is not the place that we can actually do the underlying decomposition of why gains were made very well. But we've looked at whether the composition of the schools makes a difference. And nationally, it is true that we have a more difficult to educate population today than we did 20 years ago. We have more immigrants, more non-native English speakers, Hispanics in particular, but other groups also that have come in that make schools more difficult to teach in. And that might explain a portion of the overall performance. But by the just crude estimates of how much there's been a demographic shift in the country, you find that you couldn't explain more than 20% of the changes by demographics in the states that have had the largest demographic changes. And a number of states haven't had that large of a demographic change, and yet their performance has not been explained by that.
And in a similar vein, we have another question from an audience member who is referencing the report and is asking about the differences in results reported between different grades for 4th and 8th grade. And the question is whether there are, if you could speak to the major changes that you see or don't see when the results are separated by grades as it is, or in subject, if you did that separation.
Well, we've separated it by both grades and subjects. This is, I think, a fundamental question that has come up with NAEP scores and performance in general. U.S. schools have done better in 4th grade than they have in 8th grade by our NAEP standards, and better in 8th grade than in 12th grade or for 17-year-olds by the NAEP standards. What we're doing here is just describing the answer. We don't have a complete explanation for this. We know that, for example, a lot of research has gone into early reading, and we've learned a lot about how to do early reading, maybe less about comprehension in reading that comes in at later grades. So there are these differences. We're at a point where we can describe them, but we can't give you an explanation for them or a policy implication out of them.
So just to add to that, I think the basic story is the greatest gains that have occurred over the last 20 years have been in 4th grade. If you want to look at the place in American education that has definitely has improved, it's at the elementary school level. By 4th grade, kids are learning more than they did 20 years ago. I think the evidence is pretty strong on that. At the 8th grade, the gains are substantially less. But I think that's starts showing up a lot better when you look at the 8th grade. So let us take, for example, on page 32 of the report, or figure B4, the top performing states on the 8th grade, at the 8th grade, are Massachusetts, New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware, South Carolina, Louisiana. Now that's pretty much the same group. Florida, it's true, does move down the list. So Florida is now 10th, but it's still among the top growers. It's still in the top 10. Now if you look at the bottom states, in 8th grade, it's Iowa, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Maine, Wyoming. Now these are states that were performing generally low in the initial analysis. So there's some changes. A few states may bounce around a bit, but the story is not like some states are doing better at the middle school level and other states are not doing as well at the middle school level. It's more the middle school looks like a problem. The middle years of education looks like a much bigger problem in American education than the elementary school.
Great. Our next question comes from Kim Holmes, and her question is, what your thoughts are on the best mechanism by which this urgency could be translated into direct action. Do you think this is the role of the State Department of Education or the Federal Department of Education or some other group?
Well, I think that the answer has to reside in the states because our structure of government of schools leads the states to be the dominant force there. Now, the mechanism that I would look at would be reform of the way teachers are trained, hired, and retained and paid so that we can improve the overall quality of teachers in the classroom. This comes not from this particular study, but from a wide body of other research that indicates that teacher quality and teacher effectiveness is by far the largest element of what goes on in schools, and that's what we have to focus our attention on if we are going to be serious.
You know, it's one of the things about this study is by focusing on what are the facts, where do you see the gains, where do you not see the gains, you sort of cut across all of these debates as to what do you need to do in order to improve things, and everybody can look at the data and sort of draw their own conclusions. One of the conclusions that I draw is that we have to motivate students in our middle and high schools to a greater extent than they are today. They don't really have clear objectives. They're not really being held accountable. We talk about holding schools accountable, but schools are not people, and only people can be held accountable. And so the primary person who needs to be held accountable is the student. And countries around the world that do have examinations which students are expected to perform well on if they're going to move on to higher education or into positions in the labor force, it's very clear in those countries what you have to learn in high school, and that clarity, I think, has an impact on how much kids learn, and it also helps clarify for teachers what it is they need to teach. So I think one of the problems that we have is a lack of clarity, and if a state can give that kind of clarity, that's great. I do think it's going to be a task that's above the local individual school. It's got to come from a broader body, whether it's the federal government or state government.
And we have another question going back to the disaggregation of the data about whether the data were disaggregated by subject. So if there were any differences in the trends between math and reading, and whether those varied between countries or if that wasn't a disaggregation you worked on.
We do have that data. I don't know that. I think it is the case that the United States lags particularly in math, and we found that from our other studies, and I think that's true here. But Rick, you may have something more.
I mean, overall, the U.S. does worst in math and better in science and better in reading, but the trends tend to be pretty consistent across subjects. What we did in developing the trends was to try to sort of eliminate any influence of specific subject matters to get an overall trend. But when we drop out, say, reading, we get the similar kind of answer.
So we do have that data. I don't know that we have released it, but if somebody's interested in that, I think we could supply that information.
So then our next question is what you think are some of the factors that might be different between the United States and other countries that are performing at a higher level in their growth rates. If there's anything that you can identify as potential factors.
Well, we're going to be holding a conference at Harvard University on Thursday and Friday of this week, in which we are going to be bringing people from around the world to discuss this actual question. So some of the people from the countries that are the highest performing ones are going to be coming to talk about what they think are the key factors that help to explain their success. And so I'm looking personally very forward to this conversation. I think most scholars tend to resist coming up with any explanation based on a single case or a few cases. And if you look at the data more generally, you see some evidence that accountability makes a difference. You see some evidence that paying teachers according to performance makes a difference, that school choice makes a difference. But there's a lot of disagreement, and the evidence is not conclusive on any of these points.
Well, as we know, one of the big export industries of Finland is tours to see what their schools are doing. And so large numbers of people are flocking to Finland because they've had very high scores on these tests, so that they can find out what's going on there. And people point to all kinds of different things, from different demographics to starting later in school to differences in class size and autonomy of schools. As Paul pointed out, I think each of us as authors has done a lot of work looking across the world at what determines performance, and it's really hard to pick out separate factors from the small numbers of countries we have, which we know are very different. On the other hand, as Paul points out, there are some consistencies in terms of the institutional structure of schools that point to some things that might be exported other places.
So just to add to that, our study does not show Finland to be one of the all-time great improvers since 1994. It comes in number 18. It's higher than the United States at number 25, but it's been overtaken by its neighbor across the Baltic Sea, Latvia. So I imagine the next export industry will come from Latvia.
So one point that wasn't brought up really in the webinar that we should point out here, lots of people want to look across the world at different countries that are doing well and figure out whether we can import something from them. The alternative thing to do is to look across the United States, where we see these very different growth rates in achievement between Maryland and Delaware and Massachusetts. And if we did at the level of our top states, we would be improving internationally. So that if we could figure out what is going on in Maryland and Massachusetts and whatever at the top, and replicate that in Iowa and Wisconsin, we would find that we are doing much better internationally. And I think that that's a better source of example than looking to Latvia to figure out how we should improve our schools according to Latvian ways.
Well, we are definitely going to have at the conference on Thursday and Friday some folks from Massachusetts and Maryland and Florida. So we will hear from the top performing states what they have to say. It'll be quite interesting because they're not going to say the same thing. There's going to be a range of opinion.
Great. So our next question comes from Greg Schuckman, and the question is, what can policymakers take away from this report to guide the ESEA reauthorization?
Do better. The biggest point of this report is to indicate that we aren't meeting the lofty goals that were set in 1989 in Williamsburg, Virginia by the governors, who said we should be first in the world in mathematics and science by the year 2000. And we're not on the path to do that. So that while everybody recognizes the importance of education, most people recognize that we're not doing particularly well with our schools, and everybody has challenging goals. The one thing that's been left out is success at meeting those goals.
Well, I would also want to emphasize the half-full, half-empty nature of this set of findings. If you want to be optimistic, you can say the United States grew at a rate which led to a growth of 20 2% of a standard deviation, which is certainly a significant trend in the period between 1994 and 2009. And that's the period when No Child Left Behind came into effect. There certainly is evidence, if you want to see it in the data here, that No Child Left Behind might have had a positive effect, and there are other studies that show the greatest growth has been in those countries which put into place accountability systems earliest. And those that didn't put them into place until 2002, when No Child Left Behind was passed, then began to pick up at a faster speed. So I would say one message is that No Child Left Behind accountability system should not be treated as having had a negative impact on American education. However, you can also say its positive impact has been enough. And it was the way we did that accountability system was a very crude and imperfect way. And so whereas we got something out of it, we didn't get anything more out of it than the median country did around the world. Now, we could have done worse. We could have been going south like Sweden. There are countries that did, there were 24 countries that did worse than the United States. So it is possible that we could have had the worst record over the past 15 to 20 years. So it's, we got to realize this study can be interpreted as, we've made some progress. We just have to move to a new level if we're going to achieve the goals that we set.
Great. And it looks like one last question is whether there is an expectation that the adoption of the Common Core curriculum could assist the United States in improving our ranking moving forward.
Well, we might have a difference of opinion on this. The Common Core has obviously been heavily discussed in lots of places. When I look at the Common Core, I think it's somewhat irrelevant to these numbers. And I arrive at that conclusion because when we look across states today, the states with the toughest standards don't necessarily do better than the states with the weakest standards. So if you simply correlate NAEP scores with the rankings of states according to their standards, you see there's no correlation at all. What I take away from that is not that standards aren't good. I don't want to leave that impression. I like the idea of specifying good, rigorous standards, but that standards by themselves don't do much, and that we have to improve the schools and what goes on in the classroom, and that can be done with or without tough standards.
Well, I don't disagree with that at all, Rick. I would just say it's a very complicated question. We are going to have a paper on this topic at the conference, and I'm sure this is going to be a lively part of the discussion. And my own view is exactly yours, which is it sounds good, but a lot is going to depend on how it's all implemented.
Well, my real concern is that we're putting much too much emphasis on introducing Common Core standards and getting them established, so that all of the attention is going to that process as opposed to the other things that are important to raise the achievement and learning of students.
Well, I think if there's anything that this study suggests, it is that there is no silver bullet. There was a silver medal. It went to, I think, Florida. So there was a silver medal, but there is no silver bullet. Thank you all for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Rick and Paul, for sharing the findings of your report with us. If you have any closing statements, I'm sure the audience would be very glad to hear those.
Well, my only closing statement is that I can think of no other issue that's more important to the future of the country. There are debates about the the fiscal situation and a variety of other things in the country, but the quality of our labor force and of our society in terms of learning and knowledge will determine our future. And right now, we're not on a path that's going to be very good for our children.
I find it remarkable how little discussion has taken place about this extremely important topic in the presidential campaigns. We have had a presidential campaign that has virtually ignored the education issue. Maybe that's because the candidates essentially agree that this is really, really important and we have to do something about it, and there's nothing to disagree about. Let's hope that's the explanation.
Great. Thank you very much for joining us, everyone.